Hi, I'm Daniel Hedefin. I'm the chair of the New Zealand branch of the RTSA. So just before we get into the presentation, I'm just going to do a bit of a talk about a bit of an intro about the RTSA for those that aren't familiar. And with 200 people online, I think there might be a few newcomers to our presentations. So Rail Technical Society of Australasia. We're for anyone that's got a professional interest in railways across Australia and New Zealand. Our objectives are as stated on the slide here. So generally anything with a technical nature or that progresses professional development in railway work and railway engineering, and hopefully in New Zealand. But we are interested in presentations that cover any rail work across the globe, particularly Australasia and particularly New Zealand. You'll see there that the rate for members, we think a pretty reasonable $80. And we, through that, or for that, we try and do regular online continuing professional development sessions like this one. And we do probably around 3 or 4 a year in-person events, which we try and have across a couple of locations in New Zealand. And upcoming, we hope to be facilitating a conference on the City Rail Link in Auckland in a couple of months' time. So we're always interested in new members, and we're always interested in people that are keen to present to our membership about interesting things on railway engineering. Just a couple of things about the presentation. There'll be questions and answers at the end. There's a question piece that you can enter questions in online, and we'll cover those off at the end. But now I'll just jump to a quick intro of this presentation. So it's by Michael van Drovenbroek. Michael is a transport consultant with here at Edenvale at the moment. He has around 30 years of experience in working in railways. Currently, he's working with clients on rail, public transport and freight projects in both New Zealand and various overseas areas. And that includes the Middle East. In his career, he's held various roles from management to senior executive roles with public transport, railway and strategic projects, strategic planning in Victoria, in Australia, and the UAE, so over in the Middle East. And he had quite a long period of time working in New Zealand Rail in various guises through Transrail and what came after that, and QRail. So I met Michael quite a few years ago, and I'm not sure if it was during the Transrail time or just after that. And we interacted a bit, and I found him a really engaging and interesting member of the New Zealand Rail community. So it's great that he's available to present to us today. And myself, I've got a particular interest in regional rail travel. I've been an occasional commuter on the Capital Connection when I lived in Palmerston North back in the 90s. And then a bit over a decade ago, I became a regular commuter on that from the Kapiti Coast. I've also enjoyed recently taking the Auckland to Hamilton train to Huia to see how that works. And back when it was functioning, I used to regularly take the Bay Express. And I wish I could take the Bay Express to send my kids back to Hawke's Bay, but they get stuck on the bus. So really interesting to hear from Michael, and I'll hand over to you, Michael, now.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for that introduction, and also thank you to Rebecca. Starting off, I'd like to just give a quick overview of New Zealand Railways characteristics. This is quite a reasonably long presentation, so there'll be a copy of it posted on my website, so you can go and peruse it, and I believe it'll be available through the RTSA as well. So many of you will know this already, but I'll just give a quick overview. It's a Cape Gauge railway in New Zealand, 1067 millimetres. is approximately 3,700 kilometres currently active. There's an additional 400 kilometres mothballed. It's a 1,500 kilometre current network for passenger, mostly diesel. The main trunk on the North Island was electrified in the 1980s between Palmerston North and Hamilton to 25 kV, and Auckland Metro in the 2010s to 25 kV, and Wellington Metro is 1,500 volt DC, dating back to the mid-1930s. There's been quite a lot of recent investment to rehabilitate, replace assets. The axle load is generally quite low by international standards for freight, about 18 tonnes on most lines, some are less at 16. Inter-island capable ferries link North and South Islands with 2 large rail capable vessels on order for 2025 delivery. The top rated speed for passenger in New Zealand is 110 kilometres per hour on the North Island main trunk, but generally it's not used at that speed, mostly at 100. The Silver Fern rail cars and some of the EMUs only do that top speed. Many lines only do 90 or 80 or even less kilometres per hour. And it's, like I said, it's predominantly freight network and with limited interregional passenger trains and some long distance scenic trains. Freight includes commodities like bulk, intermodal export, domestic intermodal logistics and manufactured products. This is just a quick overview, a pictorial of KiwiRail. It's an important part of the New Zealand landscape, creating value in the total supply logistics chain. It has a passenger network and it's embedded in New Zealand society, linking ports and towns and cities to the hinterland. Many freight trains traverse the country every day, and the inter-island ferries that are rail capable are ro-ro ferries. Going back one page, this is the map of the New Zealand rail network. As you can see, it pretty much spans the length of the country and goes east to west on both islands. The spine is the North Island main trunk in orange, you can see here, and going down across the ferries to Invercargill in the deep south, with Auckland and Wellington Metro networks. Again, you can see this on my website for greater detail to give you more time to absorb these sorts of things. I'll just give an overview of the structure of the industry in New Zealand. The main government agencies are KiwiRail, state-owned enterprise, access provider, network owner, developer, and freight services operator, and long-distance regional passenger. There's New Zealand Transport Agency, Waka Kotohai, which is the funding regular multimodal transport planner. The Ministry of Transport do the policy and advice across transport. Auckland Transport are a client planner for the Auckland Metro Passenger Rail, same for Wellington, Regional Council for Wellington, and Waikato for Waikato. And other regional councils are also potential clients for regional passenger rail. To be clear, this presentation is mostly on regional and inter-regional passenger rail and the future thereof. The operators and major participants in terms of operations are KiwiRail, as I described, Transdev Wellington, the operator of Metro Rail in Wellington since 2016, Comfort Dalgrau UGL, Auckland One Rail, operator of Auckland Metro since 2022, CAF for the rolling stock maintainer and Metro until United Group take it over after 2024, Hyundai Rotem do the same in Wellington, and various other rail operators, including Dunedin Railways and GVR, have access to the network for heritage and tourism type services. Passenger growth in New Zealand reached its peak probably in the late 1950s with the introduction of the rail cars, the Fiat rail cars, which were a regional service, and included the expansion into railways road services, linking towns and cities that weren't directly connected by rail. By the 1970s, we had a pretty comprehensive network, but it started to decline as the rail cars hit problems. Road services gradually took over many passenger rail services. However, the inter-island ferry between Wellington and Picton linked these services up. The rail cars were a mixed blessing. When they were launched in New Zealand in 1955, as you can see in this advertisement, it was an expression of confidence, and they were doing well initially. But by the mid-1960s, they ran into various problems, including mechanical problems. And then by the 1970s, they were pretty much all withdrawn, some being carried over into locomotive haul train sets. And this cartoon on the right says the lost white elephants of New Zealand infrastructure. And as you can see there, the rail cars are a core part of that. However, in the South Island, at one stage, it was home to New Zealand's fastest train. You had the South Island Limited Express streaking across the Canterbury Plains. By the 1970s, it was replaced by the Southerner Express, and that was faster and smoother over time because it had less station stops. Also in the 1970s, top-notch Premier trains linked major parts of New Zealand. The Silver Star was a sleeper train between Auckland and Wellington. The Blue Streak was between Wellington and New Plymouth. And you had trains like the Endeavour going between Wellington and Napier, which later became the Bay Express. In the 1990s, there was a last gasp of regional rail growth in New Zealand. The Kaimai Express was reintroduced, which had been previously cancelled in the 1960s between Auckland and Tauranga, and the Geyserland rail car was introduced between Auckland and Rotorua. Both these services only lasted 10 years and by 2001 had been suspended and then cancelled completely. Moving forward to today, KiwiRail and Auckland Metro and Wellington Metro are the main operations in New Zealand. Like I said, Auckland Metro is run by CDC and UGL, Auckland One Rail. Wellington Metro is run by Transdev. Regional Rail, KiwiRail, runs the Te Huia service between Auckland and Hamilton and between Palmerston North and Wellington for the Capital Connection. And there's Great Journeys, New Zealand scenic trains, the Northern Explorer, the Coastal Pacific, and the Transalpine. Here's an interesting slide from 1967 with a New Zealand built 1938 rail car. This was just a trial run, so I shouldn't get carried away about how fast it could do, but basically it could go from Auckland to Wellington in 8 hours, 37 minutes. And as a subset of that journey, the transit time from Hamilton Frankton to Auckland Strand was 1 hour and 35 minutes with a 1938 rail car. Today, the same journey on Te Huia takes 2 hours 25. Now, there are many reasons why the trains are slower today, and a lot of it's to do with congestion, but it just shows you the specification of New Zealand Railways by international standards is really not that poor. It's actually quite good, but over time, lack of investment has caused this speed to slip away on some corridors. This is an interesting slide about public transport trends. It's just Auckland. What it shows is that first peak in the 1940s with the trams in Auckland had higher public transport usage than what Auckland does today. And that's when Auckland was only a third of the size that it is today. As you can see, when the trams were taken away, that's the dark blue, and were replaced by buses, that sort of medium blue, public transport patronage fell away rather quickly. There were some trolley buses in there, that's the light blue below. But over time, as services were curtailed and people focused more on buses, public transport declined significantly. With reinvestment in the 1990s and beyond, and most recently in the 2000s, rail has started to recover and public transport across New Zealand has increased. So as you can see, when you invest in public transport, it really does increase. And of course, the decline in the 1950s was a lot to do with the private motor car, but it was also taking away public transport options. The case for national integrated public transport planning, New Zealand's at a junction when it comes to interregional public transport. Will it continue its rail focus of almost entirely focusing investment on urban passenger in Wellington and Auckland? Or can it expand to planning to include passenger rail reconnecting regions and go back to the heartland as a national network? This comes down to what sort of country we want New Zealand to be. At stake is social equity, national connectivity, transport accessibility, meeting climate change commitments, improved transport safety, regional rejuvenation, affordable access to housing, and even patriotic national pride as one joined up nation. Few things give the perception of a united nation like a quality rail network. However, we need national consensus to correctly identify viable opportunities and problems trying to solve to fulfill the potential to help build a more sustainable future that helps New Zealand fully realise its potential. Linking opportunities to spatial planning is also important in this regard. I'd like to talk briefly about a report that's just been released by Tarakan Global calling Making Rail Work. This isn't a technical document, it's more a discussion document. And there is no reason to believe that the bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning they are any better at solving problems than people on the spot who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right. It's important that the railway is brought back to the people of New Zealand. The policy for intercity and community rail networks should never have been abandoned in New Zealand without a proper intergenerational and cross-society discussion. This wasn't uncommon in other parts of the world as well, but the world has changed. Networks like rail make everyone in society feel connected. The longer we avoid the conversation, the more expensive it gets to fix the oversights of the past. It's time to start a new conversation. I recommend strongly you read this report. It's actually a very interesting expose into the history and politics, to some extent, of how railway can develop in a country like New Zealand. Interregional funding processes. The Ministry of Transport are currently working on guidance for local councils to assist planning, costing, funding, and other considerations for new passenger rail service development frameworks. Waka Katauhai are responsible for funding government's contributions to services, and KiwiRail as an operator is involved. Currently, regional councils and Waka Katauhai contribute funding to the current interregional Trans Te Huia and Capital Connection. The process to consider viability, establishment of further interregional passenger trains in New Zealand is spelled out on KiwiRail's website. Well worth a look. It is up to the regions to prioritise new services in what is called the Regional Land Transport Plans, the RLTPs, which are used by Waka Katauhai to determine regional transport initiative funding. Including regional rail in the RLTP signals a new passenger rail service is ready for funding. Only then does the government consider it to be prioritised in the New Zealand Rail Plan, a 10-year vision for rail in New Zealand to guide the investment decisions. And an investment plan flows out of the rail plan. This approach highlights a significant deficiency in the current process, however. Everything has to be integrated by the regions, whilst interregional and national public transport is clearly a national issue, making interregional rail very challenging. So we must ask, where is the national vision and who is responsible for that? The central government leadership is required with regional partnerships for interregional PT and rail to develop. The current PT planning process is biased to intra-regional, which works very well for Auckland and Wellington Rail, but not so much elsewhere. Establishment of a stronger national public transport function with a mandate to plan and develop across New Zealand integrated PT networks, buses, rails and ferries would be a start. Getting alignment with national development priorities and ensure business cases are funded, not just as regional activities, but as national development ones, is important. We are one joined up nation after all. This is not a replacement for regional council functions, rather a framework and a resource and national joined up PT planning functions. So I'm not suggesting you take the planning away from the likes of Auckland Transport. It's so important that the local input is there because you don't want to necessarily build another bureaucracy in Wellington. It's very important, though, that there is something that changes. And an overhaul of the public transport operating model is required. This is currently underway. So why interregional passenger rail? Okay, in deciding what future interregional rails may look like, it's important to establish what some key success factors may be. Key criteria including where rail has strategic advantage over other public transport modes or motor car use. Some include potential journey time advantages due to superior rail alignments, such as tunnelling, serving larger intermediate towns, or where passenger flows can be generated. An example is the route between Wellington and Wairarapa through the Remiataka Tunnel. It offers a key advantage over road compared to the trip over the hills. While strictly not interregional, as both the Hutt and Wairarapa are part of the Greater Wellington region, it does demonstrate how such advantages has seen rail flourish and be sustained in New Zealand. Analysing transport demand, current, latent, induced, and how does rail affect PT transport demand is also important. If you build it, they come to some degree. Spatial planning to ensure growth strategies and are integrated with transport priorities with regional and interregional development investments are also important. Key success factors include providing critical community links to New Zealand between city, towns and countries. We call this connecting communities. Supporting economic growth, promoting modal shift by encouraging PT by increasing its attractiveness, improving transport corridor capacity and resilience across society as a whole, enabling value for money, improving safety and reducing road congestion, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, supporting climate change initiatives, funding by value capture through things like transit hubs, TODs, development concessions like Britomart in terms of its development, Corridor, housing, land use, intensification, getting the economics right with the spatial planning, and estimating services demand right in a post-COVID-19 uncertain world. Possible inter-regional rail networks, and I'll go through these in some detail, as the Upper North Island, Golden Triangle, Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Lower North Island, Wellington, Masterton, and Wellington, Palmerston North of Whanganui, Central South Island, Christchurch, Ashburton to Timaru, national connectors, Auckland, Wellington, and Wellington, Christchurch via the Inter-Islander, local networks, including Auckland Metro, Wellington Metro, Suburban Christchurch, Mosgiel, Port Chalmers via Dunedin City, Waikato local services, and BOP local services. Tourism services, the classic Transalpine, and maybe a national tour train that can go on all passenger certified lines, charter services, and that would be a fully commercial operation without any government support. An eventual network expansion, extending Timaru further on to Dunedin and then Invercargill, Wellington to Napier and New Plymouth, and maybe even Northland Rotorua, although they're very challenging because of current infrastructure condition. And looking after our heritage operators as well, Dunedin Railways, GVR, Mainline Steam, and Steam Incorporated. So I'll just quickly go through each one of these now. So the Golden Triangle, fast, frequent passenger connections, Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga. It's important to realise that 50% of New Zealand's population lives north of about Te Awamutu, and using tri-mode rolling stock on this corridor would be important. Currently, only Te Huia runs on this corridor, launched last year, using refurbished BR carriages from the UK and hauled by DFB locomotives. Top speed is 100 kilometres an hour. The service is relatively infrequent with no service onwards to Tauranga. The Hamilton to Auckland Intercity project, Faster Rail, is currently underway for the Ministry of Transport as client. And making rail work political discussions, Tarakan Global is looking at specifically the Tauranga corridor as an example. See my website for copies of all of these documents. They're publicly released, in some cases slightly redacted, but they are there for your perusal. Auckland Metro Rail congestion north of Pukekohe is a major challenge on this corridor. Broken electrification south of Pukekohe to Rapa. Pukekohe is being electrified at the moment from Papakura. Congested freight on the East Coast Main Trunk, the Kaimai Tunnel constraints, the lack of Tauranga infrastructure, level crossings, always so very, very important when you're putting on passenger trains for active protection, track condition and alignment, and non-commercial funding requirement. Interventions include the Auckland Rail Program business case currently under development, Auckland third and partial fourth mains to allow express running to get away from congestion, Central Auckland station location, enhanced signalling, infill/European train control system, maybe up to level 2 eventually, partial track duplication of the East Coast Main Trunk, Kaimai Tunnel upgrade, new stations, level crossing upgrades with like axle counters to ensure higher speed operation as possible, alignment deviations, network speed upgrades to 130 kilometres, targeting eventually 160, and tri-mode rolling stock, possible electrification extension, and the funding delivery model. I won't dwell on this slide. It's there for you to read in more detail later on. It's just about Te Huia. Its performance was mixed initially because of COVID, but it's now picking up momentum. But longer term, it really needs extra capacity on the Auckland network to get its speed up. The Faster Rail business case is currently under development by the Ministry of Transport. It's possible this corridor could eventually see Cape Gauge tilt trains at up to 160 kilometres an hour with major alignment changes or modest curve easing over time. The Lower North Island, fast frequent passenger rail connections between Wellington, Masterton and Wellington, Palmerston North and Whanganui, up to 130 kilometres with tri-mode rolling stock again. The corridor is currently well used by rail on the Masterton corridor, but Wellington to Palmerston North is somewhat less used, with only one train a day being the capital connection. I encourage you to look at the Lower North Island Rail Integrated Mobility Stop business case. This is about new trains potentially on this network. It's currently unfunded, but was put forward for funding this year. Again, a copy of it in redacted form as publicly released is available on my website. Encourage you to have a look. Selecting rolling stock is a challenge, new maintenance stabling facilities, signalling, slower speeds on the line to Whanganui, Whanganui has the advantage, by the way, of going through towns like Feilding and Martin. So that's why I've included Whanganui. It's sort of a lower North Island Golden Triangle in a smaller way. Additional crossing loops, new stations, crossing, track conditions and alignment, and non-commercial funding sources. The Wellington Metro network upgrades are currently underway. Enhanced signalling and full ETCS for the Wellington networks is possibly on the cards. Crossing loops, new stations, modest alignment deviations, e.g. the Forest Lake curves north of Otaki, network upgrades to 120 kilometres an hour, targeting 130, and new tri-mode rolling stock. The next one is the South Island network out of Christchurch, and this would just be bi-mode. There's no electrification down there. Christchurch, Ashburton to Timaru, with relatively high speed running, because the topography between Christchurch and Timaru is largely flat, with very modest grades as you climb inland from Rolleston towards Ashburton. You could probably get up to quite high speed. So I've chosen this corridor deliberately as a segue for a South Island network development, because really it is the one where rail could compete with cars. Currently, there's no services on that line at all. There's a new rolling stock facility for the Transalpine and Coastal being built at Waltham. It could be used and maybe leveraged and expanded over time to service these types of trains. Selected rolling stock, enhanced maintenance, stabling facilities, signal, line speed has slipped to freight only speeds on this corridor. It used to be 100 kilometres, home of the Southerner, but additional crossing loops and a new station at Ashburton, and level crossings and track conditions for non-commercial funding sources. So getting this up to speed is quite an important thing. The next one is just the national subconnector networks in the 2020s to 30s. This includes the Northern Explorer between Auckland and Wellington and Picton and Christchurch. So what this does is it joins those three sub-networks, Upper North Island, Lower North Island, and South Island, into one integrated network. Over time, the Northern Explorer and Coastal Pacific would be repurposed with new carriages, and the fleet of AK cars would be released for tour trains, for which they were designed as scenic services. Selecting new rolling stock, enhancing maintenance facilities and signalling upgrades and track conditions is important on this corridor. The track could gradually be upgraded to 110 to 120 kilometres an hour, but I suggest the high speed is not so critical on these corridors, even though it's longer distance. And it will leverage off the existing upgrades on Lower and North Island, Lower and Upper North Island. Local regional rail metro networks exist in Auckland and Wellington, could exist in Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Christchurch and Dunedin. Timeframes is mostly 2030s and beyond. Would include various electrification extensions, signalling upgrades, no current local networks in Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Christchurch and Dunedin. Selected challenges include new rolling stock, enhanced maintenance, stabling facilities, remediations and crossing loops, etc. Dunedin Railways could be utilised to run a train from Port Chalmers to Mosgiel through the heart of the city as a segue to building a case for this metro type of operation across New Zealand. The rolling stock is currently underutilised, and whilst it's not up to modern standards for mainline running, it would be for a regional passenger rail service in a metropolitan area. Funding models and delivery models need to be developed. The tourism charter network is the Transalpine and a tour train that would travel New Zealand. This is similar to Journeys Beyond in Australia, where you can have a tour train that travels the length of the country, and it's a fully commercial service that would use the AK cars and DFB type rolling stock locomotives. Speeds of 100 kilometres an hour are more than sufficient, and it can go to areas where passenger trains don't normally run. Currently, the Transalpine runs, and the Northern Explorer could be repurposed to one tour set with the Coastal travelling the length of New Zealand, one for the North Island maybe and one for the South Island. And it's dependent on releasing the AK fleet for repurposing over time, with the Northern Explorer and Coastal Pacific trains being routed with new passenger trains. That's an important part of that. Here's a look into what the AK cars look like with a reconfigured seating layout. Ultimate network expansion. Okay, beyond the 2030s and extending the passenger rail networks further south, Dunedin to Invercargill, and Hawke's Bay, Napier and New Plymouth, and perhaps even Northland Rota could occur. None of these services exist today, but over half of them existed up until 2001. Infrastructure standards have fallen since this time, and effectively it's now just a freight-only network. Selecting rolling stock, enhanced maintenance facilities, and all the other things I've mentioned before are important as part of that. I just want to touch very briefly on heritage operations. Heritage lines like the Otago Central line have fallen into disrepair to Middlemarch. So I'm suggesting maybe that a fund could be set up for bidding to help out companies like Dunedin Railways to support New Zealand's cultural heritage. It's important that New Zealand does do something in this space because Tauri Gorge Railway is up for potential closure. This is not without precedent funding these sorts of operations. A similar thing happens in Australia with the Puffing Billy. So I encourage you to have a read of what I've suggested here. This is what new emerging rolling stock could look like. There's the Velocity in Victoria. Okay, it's broad gauge. It's maybe not ideal for New Zealand, but it gives an idea of what a regional railcar service can look like. There's Etihad Rail. There's where I worked in the United Arab Emirates. And there's the Wink train service, which is done by Stadler. Plus there's a Deutsche Bahn train there, which could be used using hydrogen. Key investment summaries. Infrastructure, civil works, e.g. track speed upgrades to 90, 110, 130 and 160. However, it's important to realise that average speed is way more important than top speed. Signalling upgrades, ETCS, communications-based train control, line capacity enhancements, new and upgraded stations, rolling stock selections for EMU, DMU, tri-mode, stabling facilities for interpeak and overnight. This is often quite difficult. It's not a given. You have to make space sometimes in what are congested areas to stable trains. Maintenance facilities could be reinventing what happens in some of the regions. I note that one of the proposals has a maintenance facility being built at Masterton, for example. Last mile solutions for door-to-door travel, autonomous vehicles, mobility as a service to have one joined up journey, and other things like simulators and control centres and tap and ride ticketing. And I also suggest New Zealand increases its rail knowledge and competence through a New Zealand Rail Academy. This would rebuild rail and public transport knowledge and professional development, and certainly help the RTSA quite a lot with its work. Key barriers and challenges in a summary sense are the Auckland network rail congestion. That's a huge issue, but it is being addressed. In order to get trains from Auckland to Tauranga and Hamilton, well, that issue really does need addressing because you can't have long distance trains running to an all stops pattern in terms of speed. Getting ETCS and CBTC signalling in place where it is appropriate, communications-based train control. The East Coast main trunk congestion, the Kaimai Tunnel needs addressing, single track issues in Tauranga entry, current focus on freight network standards rather than passengers in the regions, a lack of integrated national public transport, getting the numbers right for forecasting demand, current, latent, induced, funding sources, delivery timeframes. Well, here's one that's very sort of left of field, but very important. Non-partisan political support across all the political parties as much as possible, consensus building to avoid political football of rail from the past, rail and PT industry delivery, reform, accountability and value for money. I believe the industry needs to step up a little bit in that space over time. It's coming from a very low base and is starting to do much better, of course. Rail industry delivery, knowledge capability, Academy of Rail, as I foreshadowed, and other public transport integration with buses like Intercity for connecting to non-rail served regions. In summary, national public transport functions at a national level need improving and integrating. Staged improvements, 10 to 30 years with an eye on a vision of continuous build-up, starting with the Golden Triangle, followed by the North Island, Lower North Island. Regional involvement is critical to keep planning attuned to local needs, but with a nationwide lens that is needed to connect communities nationwide across regional boundaries. A compelling case for all stakeholders for approval of funding and delivery is required, and this may be a 10 to 30 year plus vision. Funding regimes using value capture, TOD, transit orientated developments, New Zealand Land Transport Fund, overseas funding partners, population growth, capital release from these private car ownership models, community-based partnerships, including co-ops. Passenger rail isn't needed on all lines. Public buses are fine for many routes in New Zealand. Rail's key advantages should be leveraged, more direct routes, faster corridors, key population flows. Average speed is more important than top speed, and various delivery models, including franchising, concessions, or a national operator like V-Line that is focused on passenger rail rather than mixed focus like freight and passenger combined. which can create conflicts of interest. This isn't just about the here and now. We need to think outside the box. Ambitions and new thinking is required. And I'd like to end the presentation with just this takeaway, and this is from the 1930s. It says, by using your own transport system, you avoid worry, save money, and reduce taxation. Generally, people think of using rail as increasing taxation because of subsidy requirements, but new thinking is required. Let's do this, New Zealand. And finally, there is a book that I could recommend to you that is called Can't Get There From Here. Whilst I might not agree with everything in the book in terms of its ambition, it's a great repository of information and is very insightful reading. And also I suggest you read the Tarakan Global Report on my website. Thank you. Back to you, Daniel.
Hey, that was awesome, Michael. I found that, yes, there's some great stuff in there, and I've been following the number of people that have been attending. I saw it peak at about 312. There's still 300 people with us, so we'll look to take questions as long as people are hanging around, and depending on Michael's timeframe availability. But please, there's a Q&A piece, and there's only the one question in there at the moment. Couple getting added, so put them in. But I've got a question, if I could start. That comparison, I really like that comparison you made earlier on about journey times in the past, and using 1938 vintage rail cars. I think you said it was an 8-hour, 37-minute journey in 1967 on the trunk.
Great.
And so while you're doing it, I went and got my New Zealand Railways Atlas just to look up some stuff. And I think those with a knowledge of New Zealand Railways, like yourself, will know since 1967 there's been some pretty significant upgrades on the North Island main trunk, been electrified for one, but there's been, I think, when I look through, four reasonably significant deviations that have greatly increased track speed in some areas. But the current journey time for the Northern Explorer leaves Auckland at 7:45 and gets into Wellington at 6:25. So I saw the focus on, hey, can we get to 120, 130, 160 kilometre line speeds? And that's something that often gets mentioned by people. And I'm guessing, just seeing a couple of points coming through, people are thinking the same in questions. My question would be, if we've made the North Island trunk faster significantly since 1967, yet we're running 2 hours slower, do we not have a congestion issue rather than a track speed issue? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So first of all, going back to that 1967, that was lapsed travel time for the train running. It didn't include extended station stops or anything like that. So you'd have to add to that. Plus also, it was a bit of a test run. So it had priority. It certainly wasn't the standard run on the North Island main trunk at the time. But what it did show is what the infrastructure was capable of if all the roadblocks were removed. The biggest issue is congestion in Auckland. It's huge. 20 years ago, to get from Papakura to Auckland was about 28 minutes or something like that. Today, it's closer to 50 minutes for Te Huia because it's following all stopping pattern trains. There's nowhere for trains to pass trains ahead of you. So if you're an express train, you end up having to go to all the station stopping speeds. So that's a huge issue. Another issue is some of the track in Wellington has the same sort of issues down there, but not nearly as much as Auckland. And another thing is the priority of trains. This train had a clear path signalled all the way through. It had people working in train control at the time that said, we want to get this train through as fast as possible, and they enabled that. So, but you're right, there's been huge deviation improvements since the 1960s, including Mankaweka deviation, a lot of associated with the North Island main trunk. Since the 1980s, though, there's been pretty much nothing. And basically heavier, longer freight trains. The line has been upgraded for heavier freight trains, but it hasn't really been upgraded for top level in line for passenger trains, if you know what I mean by that. And the rail cars were always faster. The Silver Fern was faster than the Northern Explorer. It had a top speed of 110 kilometres an hour. And to be clear about the higher speed, 160 kilometres an hour. Yeah, that's a challenge on the main trunk, anywhere south of Hamilton or north of Palmerston North, pretty much. And getting up to that, as we know from my experience in V-Line in Australia, is very challenging. There's a lot of work you have to do to sleepers and rail and formation, soft formations, things like the Kekowhata swamp in New Zealand. So our geotechnical conditions are very challenging. Our rail is generally lighter and it's shunted around a bit by freight trains. I'll give the example in Australia. I worked on the ARTC upgrade quite a bit for inland rail and trying to get faster velocity trains between Melbourne and Albury. And the ARTC track, because it was used by heavy freight trains, was in a much poorer condition for speed. Although it was better for heavy freight trains, it wasn't that great for passenger trains. So this is the problem we have in New Zealand. It's a freight network focused on freight, and a passenger train network is quite different. But there's a lot of improvements that are doable.
Sweet. Thanks for that. Now, since I said let's put some questions up, we've been inundated with them. Now, people are putting them in the chat. I'd ask, can you put them in the Q&A? If they're in the chat, I'm not going to be able to get to those because we've already got quite a few questions in the Q&A section. So please stop in the chat, chuck them in the Q&A. Now, I'll just try and go to, there's been a couple of questions about speed. I think some of that might have just been covered in, but one on the gauge of New Zealand's railway. So it mentions narrow gauge rail.
Cape gauge, yeah.
I think what Cape gauge. So for those that are less familiar with rail, with New Zealand or rail terminology, the track gauge, distance between rail, that's what people are referring to when they talk about Cape gauge or narrow gauge. But you actually have your rolling stock clearance gauge as well, which is a separate thing. So the person's actually noting two questions here. Could you elaborate whether the narrow gauge railway line restricts the amount of rolling stock that is available worldwide?
So it's not so much the gauge in New Zealand. I mean, look, the top world speed record for narrow gauge 3'6" was well over 200 kilometers an hour, and you can easily do 160. It's more the kinematic envelopes that the way the trains fit into our tunnels and through our stations and through our constraints. As you saw, we've managed to fit British Rail Mark II carriages from the 1970s, and that was 4'8.5" in the UK, 1435 millimeters. And they fitted on New Zealand well. The only thing they had to do was they had to make smaller diameter wheels to be able to have the cars sit a bit lower to the ground. So it does limit the rolling stock in New Zealand to some degree. It has to be bespoke and designed for New Zealand conditions. You can't just pick up a Japanese 3'6" gauge, which is the standard gauge in Japan, other than Shinkansen, which is the normal wider gauge. And plonk it on New Zealand rails. It doesn't work. And you can't even do that with Queensland trains because their kinematics are different to ours. So as the AK fleet was designed, it was specially designed to fit our tunnels and our kinematic envelopes. And all the trains like Matangi, well, that was constrained by the Johnsonville tunnels. So it was smaller profile than, say, the AKs and, than the EMUs in Auckland, which have a higher clearance. But yes, there are some constraints, and any rolling stock purchase for New Zealand generally has to be designed for New Zealand. You can't just pick one off the shelf. What you can do is pick one off the shelf maybe and modify it for New Zealand operating conditions.
Not nice answer. And so I think people, those not familiar with New Zealand Rail, really need to bone up on that piece about narrow gauge. It's not just unique to New Zealand. And I think you mentioned a point there, Michael, the British rail cars, which is a significant amount of use on the Wairarapa line up to Palmerston North, the Tahuia train down to Hamilton. They're all the British rail cars. I think Mark IIs and others out there have more experience with them than me, but it's useful to know those fit within our network. So clearance gauge, rolling stock gauge, it's been referred, had people refer me to the UK a few times, that a gauge is in some ways not too dissimilar to that, very different than if you're going to Australia or America. We can't do double stack containers in New Zealand because of the tunnels.
Exactly, and the British rolling stock kinematics, I mean, the British railways, a lot of it was built in the early 1800s, and the first, even before 1850, so quite narrow loading gauge as opposed to track gauge, which are entirely different things, right? So when you brought those BR cars over to New Zealand, they had to be rebogeyed, obviously, so they put 3'6" bogies on as opposed to 4'8½". And the wheels had smaller diameters, so the train just sits a little bit lower to the ground than what it did in Great Britain, and it fitted through our tunnels, and it goes even through the Transalpine route, which has some quite tunnels, not on the AKs, but on the amended luggage van that's been built that can actually fit, as I understand it, because the AKs were a brand new build, of course, and a new design.
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question, and IT wise, it's disappeared for me. The question was night trains, and I've experienced this myself, both in Europe and in Wellington to Auckland and back. Any thoughts on reintroduction of the night train services? I can't remember what it used to be called, but
yeah, the Northerner, the Silver Star. Yeah. No, definitely. So generally night voyages sit into what you would call a 12-hour envelope of time. You want bus basically to leave in the late, mid-evening to late evening, say around 8 p.m. onwards, and arrive in the destination before 7:30 in the morning. So it gives you roughly a 12-hour window. The route between Auckland and Wellington is ideally suited for that, and you don't actually have to run those trains particularly fast. In fact, sometimes you want to run them so that they fit that time gate that I've given you. So you actually can run them a little bit slower and a little bit more gently, because you're running at night. You don't want to shove the passengers around in and out of their seats or their bunks if they've got bunks on board. The only problem with night trains is they're very expensive in terms of real estate on board the train. So if you have cabins or bunks, they take up a lot of room where you can put seats, and that basically means the seat fare has to go up quite a lot. I would suggest maybe more business class approach of like an aircraft would maybe be better than separate cabins. We all like separate cabins on an overnight sleeper train. It's lovely. I do it in Australia myself sometimes when I have the chance. But it does make the fares kind of expensive. But when you look at it compared to a hotel night and a travel night combined, say an early morning air flight and a hotel, it's actually not that bad. Yeah, there's certainly potential, but we need to be realistic about how you fund such a service. But as green concerns and environmental concerns become more predominant, flying may become less attractive. So there may be a push towards alternative forms of transport between the larger cities like Auckland and Wellington, and overnight passenger trains are definitely a possibility on that, and quite an exciting one. I have actually been looking into that one a bit myself.
Cool. So I'm going to try and group questions because we've got over 30 between the chat and the Q&A. But I might not go back to the.
Yeah, I can keep going after 1 o'clock for a bit, so that's okay.
Right. Costs. So not cost of the upgrades, but cost of use of service. And it's been noted against cost of flying. So cost for your back pocket for users. Your thoughts on the cost it would take and how it competes with flying?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So Te Huia, for example, is heavily subsidised as a public transport service. Its fare box recovery is probably, I don't know, maybe 10%, which is not necessarily unusual for some regional passenger trains. You set the fares at a level to compete with the price of fuel, etc., on those shorter runs. On the longer runs where you're competing with air aviation, There's an element of commercial service as there is public transport service. I'm not sure that you'd want to, and you could justify easily a heavy subsidy unless there's some things around greenhouse gas emissions, around sleeping berths. Comparing to flying, I think it could have more dynamic pricing. I mean, New Zealand does quite well with its flying. I mean, people often say, oh, you can fly from Auckland to Wellington for $89 on Jetstar or something like that. The reality is if you're traveling in peak hours, it's closer to $300 for the hour's flight. So you have to sort of examine your pricing models and make it more dynamic. I think pricing on rail in many parts of the world is more expensive than aviation. I mean, Great Britain, long distance rail is not necessarily that cheap, and it's still subsidized. So it's about trying to get the balance right between demand and doing some work on price elasticity. Certainly, if you can take into account externality benefits and get some credit to the rail operator for that in terms of subsidies or grants, that enables you to reduce the fares. I think it should be competitive with aviation. I think it's going to be challenging to make it a lot cheaper. Unless New Zealand is up for large amounts of subsidies, because let us not forget, to get these things up and running, it's going to take a lot of capital grants anyway. If you look at it in the classical financial services, much of what I've suggested it wouldn't be viable, obviously. So the government's going to have to realise that public transport and rail connectivity is more than just about what it costs financially or even economically. It's about a whole lot of things that can't even have numbers put to it financially sometimes. But yeah, I think competitive with aviation is critical. You can't afford to make it more expensive unless you're giving people something else, like the tour trains. I don't have a problem with someone paying $500 to go from Auckland to Wellington on a tour train if they get an up market level of service. In fact, some people are happy to pay that if they can get meals at their seats and all sorts of things. But if you're addressing a public utility aspect, I would say a fare between Auckland and Wellington probably has to be somewhere in the $100 to $150 range per passenger. Currently, the Northern Explorer, I think, is $219. It's somewhere between those two extremes that I've just discussed, because it's a mixed type service. It's more focused at the scenic market than maybe the commuting market.
A bit of an extension to the comparison with airports, and I think I've seen a little bit of this in the question, so I'm trying to combine a bit. But the comparison of time and cost, what sort of level of improvement do you see is needed around where trains actually go to in the different communities that they serve? And the example I'd give here is Britomart is obviously a far more useful location than the Strand, but Auckland Airport isn't in a particularly great location if you need to get into town that quick. So where the regional rail needs to go to, is it well placed in places like Christchurch or Hamilton?
I think it generally is not too bad, but what's happened in, say, for example, in Christchurch, the station's been put out at Addington. I think bringing it closer to the old station site, Morehouse Avenue, would be benefit, and then you could easily walk to the square from there. I mean, I do that walk myself when I'm down in Christchurch quite a lot, and it's only a 15-minute walk. Addington, it's closer to 45 minutes. It's just too far for that. In terms of airports, the new Puanui station, Te Huia stops there. It's only a short shuttle ride from there to the airport. I mean, that short shuttle is not that much longer than inter-terminal shuttles you have at a lot of airports that even have rail connectivity stations. So I don't think that's a huge barrier to entry. I mean, it would be nice to have a heavy rail connection to Auckland Airport, but that creates sorts of challenges in integrating it into the Auckland Metropolitan Network in terms of train pathing. You need those extra two mains, because currently the network's already filled to the brim pretty much. Stations like in Auckland around the Strand, when CRL's complete, there's different ways of thinking. You could run Te Huia a different routing where it could stop somewhere out to the west, near Mount Eden station, for example. So there are different things you can look at. In terms of ideas, I think people need to be more creative. I think one thing in the rail industry is a lot of rail people are very creative and they have a lot of ideas when you ask them. They say, have you thought about this configuration or this service mapping? Maybe if we run it via this route. I mean, at the moment, you're so constrained by congestion in Auckland, you can't really do anything. But if the congestion was relieved, you could potentially route to Huia to stop somewhere like Mount Eden Station and terminate somewhere else in the west, for example, as an idea. I'm just throwing that out there, just as a thought bubble. The Strand, I mean, yes, you could connect the Strand to the metro network by relocating Parnell Station. I'm not sure that people would like to do that now, though, because they've made a commitment to Parnell. And the Newmarket branch is not so heavily used post-CRL. But there are things that we can do to improve the penetration. I think it's important that rail also has last mile service connectivity. Some of the work I've been working a bit with Deutsche Bahn in Germany. I used to work quite closely with them, got up to Berlin a few times because they were our partner at Etihad Rail. And last mile mobility, they're really looking into that, and mobility as a service. So people have an app on their phone that tells them how they complete the whole journey. So when they get to somewhere like the Strand, they're not just left stranded in a wet and rainy location with nowhere to go without getting wet. So there are things we can do. And it is important. That last mile thing puts quite a few people off rail.
Yeah, I need to finish up around 1 o'clock, and I'm not sure, Mike, whether you want to stay to answer questions. We've still got over 200 people there, and there's plenty of questions. I'll try and cover off another thing. So the advent of electric vehicles, cars, and other more environmentally friendly non-rail transport options. Do you see that as something that will compete with the environmentally friendly aspect of rail and possibly be a bit of a disruptor for future passenger rail use?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's something that I've been thinking about. Well, they're all excellent questions, but I like that one because I've been thinking about that recently myself. Is that one of the key strategic advantages that railways always had was that you could use electric overhead to power your trains, and meanwhile the electrification of the road fleet, and this is true for freight as well, is moving ahead, and rail is too with bi and tri-mode rolling stock. I think roads have different issues. It's not just about greenhouse emissions or climate change being a major benefit of rail. I think road is catching up to rail in some of those areas, but a lot of things around congestion, taking up land space, inefficiency, a lot of tied up capital. I mean, every household owning 2 or 3 cars in New Zealand, in my view, is patently ridiculous. I understand why it is, because people don't have an alternative. But I think is a mix into the future of more car ownership sharing models where people don't necessarily own cars, they can share them or almost use them like those Uber scooters you see lying around the city all the time. But, Uber scooters for motor cars where people don't own cars. It is a bit of a threat to rail, but I don't think it's huge. And I think rail can more than address it easily. I think we need to speed up with our development of technology in terms of bi and tri-mode rolling stock. There's been a lot of progression on that in recent years, and new technology is emerging all the time, and the range of batteries is improving. I think people don't necessarily want to drive, regardless of whether it's a battery or an electric car or a petrol-driven car. People want alternatives. And people want the freedom of being able to go somewhere without having to take their car and park it. So nearly all of the issues that cars have today will still be present once you've electrified the fleet. Congestion, accessibility, parking, people that don't want to drive or people that can't drive, an aging population and a young population too that's demanding accessibility without having to own a car. So actually, it's a good thing, the greening of road transport, but I don't really see it as a major existential threat to rail.
Yeah, I attended an MIT presentation a few years back, and the self-driving cars and the Uber cars sort of that, that you call on call and that been electric, and won't that solve all problems? And the presenter made quite a good point. that no, not when everyone finishes work at 5 o'clock and dials
Yeah,
on their phone and all of the unstaffed car to
yeah,
come to them, that you'll have massive congestion of all of these electric vehicles trying to get to you to then take you home.
absolutely. Yeah. It's when you look at roading, I mean, it takes up so much land. If you take a helicopter view of the city and look at roading, the land space it takes up, and the fact that people have to drive and find parks and all sorts of things, I think it's obviously it's got a strong future, and I'm not suggesting people want their freedom taken away by not having motor cars, nothing like that. But what I am suggesting is that there will be a time coming when people don't feel the need to own and drive a car, and having other options available to them that are road-based as well as rail-based. And I mean, I'm also saying here that buses are important. This is not just about rail, it's about public transport generally, and about giving people options and ride sharing and stuff. So I think the whole transport scene is changing in New Zealand. People have to be more aware of that, and also active transport, walking and cycling to stations. I mean, my heritage is Dutch, and I went to a cycle park facility in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and it's enormous. There's thousands of bikes parked in this big sort of bike garage next to Utrecht Central Station. So people bike and cycle, and it's good to see the infrastructure for cycling and active transport in New Zealand being rebuilt. And it needs to be better integrated with public transport. And it doesn't have to be physical cycling. People can have electric cycles as well. So all of those things combined, everything has a role to play. It's not one or the other. It's about integration and connected networks.
Really good point on the integration there, Michael. I will try and finish up for myself with one last question. I'm not sure if you have more time to stay. We've still got 170 participants, so we've dropped off a bit.
Yeah,
but,
I do have some time. I mean, who would put the questions through that?
Rebecca, do we need to finish up at a particular time?
Unfortunately, so.
Okay.
I do have to shoot off also. Sorry.
I'll try and just ask one sum up question. There's been a lot of talk about faster trains, a lot of talk I've seen about double tracking and the need for what looks like quite expensive infrastructure improvements.
Yes.
Mention of we need new rolling stock or different rolling stock. Would you, and this is putting on the spot a bit unfairly of me, would you have a thought on what's the first thing that would need to be considered in a journey to improving regional rail or getting regional rail progressing more?
Well, the most important thing, the first thing, is political buy-in. That's why I referred to Katrina Ramage's report from Tarakan Global. We need to make rail less of a political football. And I know the numbers are always important. Look, I'm a numbers guy. I'm a chartered accountant. I've got a degree in economics and stuff like that. So very focused on financials. In fact, I did the business case for a $12 billion rail project in the Middle East, and that's US dollars, which is part of a $200 billion project. So some of the first things to do is getting people on board, not just Labour or National, the Greens and the ACT Party and Te Pāti Māori. We need to talk to people. If you actually talk to people and they go away from their corners about using political football to throw it around in questions in Parliament, it becomes more progressive. This thing where, one person says Te Hui is great and the next person says that it's not so great, and people just used it for political point scoring, and we become the casualty of that in rail in New Zealand. That's got to end. I'll be really, really frank about it. It's got to end. We cannot continue in this 3-year electoral cycle where rail goes from feast to famine, and I don't necessarily mean famine from the National Party, because somebody may read into that, because they put a lot of money into rail as well. But if we can get them to talk through cross-party discussions and say, hey, look, this is for New Zealand as a whole. Let's have a mature discussion. Let's not just label train people as foamers or train spotters, or road people as petrol junkies or whatever. Let's think about it as a mature group of people. The first thing we need to do, and this Tauranga example I'm using, is talk to the people, talk to the politicians ultimately, and let them understand what's involved in rail. And if you get the narrative and the story right, then there's more ability to produce a mindset change, which ultimately can lead to unblocking ways for financing. And financing just doesn't have to be from general taxation. You can use co-op models. You can go to overseas funders. I'm talking to KfW Bank in Singapore later this month about funding for rail projects in the Middle East, where countries like Jordan don't have the capital funds to build a railway. Trying to build a railway from the United Arab Emirates across Saudi Arabia through Jordan into Israel at the Mediterranean port. And a lot of organizations and countries, even the Etihad Rail, it wasn't unlimited funding. Our biggest single challenge was funding at Etihad Rail. Everybody thinks oil-rich nation, you get a lot of money quite easily. It wasn't like that. The way that project got through was through political consensus. And then you do all the technical stuff like the benefit cost ratios and the business cases and the wider economic benefits analysis and all of the things like, internal rates of return or cost of capital or who funds it, PPP or whatever. All of those things can be worked out later. I mean, and what I'm proposing here, yes, it's billions. It's probably well north of $10 billion of investment, but it's not entirely political consensus, but the light rail project in Auckland is 15 billion, potentially up to 30. And that's got a lot of consensus, although not total consensus, obviously. There's still quite a bit of friction on that one. So there is possibility to progress for New Zealand as a whole, and spreading it over time is an intergenerational investment. I'm not saying go and raise $15 billion tomorrow and put it in next year's budget. What I'm saying is this is a 10 to 30 year vision.
That's an awesome point to finish on, Michael. So there's been a ton of engagement, just the number of people that we've had. It's possibly one of our higher, if not highest number actually attending, over 300. So there's certainly a lot of interest. We got to lots of the questions, not all of them. You've noted some links to where information is that people can follow up if they've got an interest.
Yes.
And I'm sure they can find you on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, I'll post a copy of this up on my website later today. So people, if they go to www.heriot-edivale.com, which is basically on the website here, you can see that www.heriot-edivale.com. And they can click on the link. I understand that RTSA are going to distribute the presentation as well. So
yeah, we film the presentations and we make them available to those that get registered, and then they have it on the overall Australasian website. Copies of the video of this presentation get put up along with the presentation, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I'll need to draw us to a close there.
Cool. Thank you.
That's been, like I say, really appreciate your time. And I'll finish with a shout out or sorry, a request. If anyone's got similarly interesting, doesn't even have to be half as interesting to be really interesting as Michael's presentation, then we'd love to provide a forum and a means of distributing your ideas. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again, Michael, and to Engineers New Zealand, Rebecca, for helping us to present this.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel and Rebecca, very much as well for helping facilitate this. I appreciate it.